Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. If you're here, I bet it's because you like to, really get a good grasp on things, like really understand a topic, but without getting bogged down with too many little details.
Exactly. And today we're going to dive into the early architecture of Buddhism and Jainism in India. We're talking about a period from around the 6th century BCE onward, and it's a time of huge change in India with the rise of new faiths and all that.
That's right. It was like a total shakeup of the existing religious landscape.
Yeah.
You had Siddhartha Gautama with Buddhism and Vardhamana Mahavira with Jainism, offering these fresh perspectives that really challenged the status quo. And a big part of that challenge was the emphasis on ideas like equality and, of course, nonviolence, or ahimsa, as it's known in Sanskrit.
Right. And what's really fascinating is to see how those core beliefs, those principles, actually began to take physical form. And that's what we're going to explore today, the birth of these new faiths and the architectural expressions they inspired.
Yeah. So we're not just talking about like the history of the religions themselves, but how they literally shaped the landscape with temples, monasteries, stupas, all of that. We're really going to trace those architectural developments for you. And yeah, see how those buildings reflected the beliefs and practices of the people who built them.
It's a fascinating journey from those very early structures all the way through to the grand and really ornate monuments.
All right. So where do we even begin with this story of early Buddhist and Jain architecture? Where does it all start for you?
Well, for me, it makes sense to start with the day-to-day lives of those early Buddhists, particularly the monks. If you think about it, their whole way of life was based on renunciation, giving up worldly possessions.
Right. Simplicity.
Exactly. So their earliest architectural needs were very basic. They needed shelter for themselves as they traveled and taught, and of course they needed places to gather and practice their faith. And as the community grew, they also needed dedicated spaces to honor the Buddha. So those initial architectural forms really grew organically out of those essential needs.
So it all starts with function, practicality. And that brings us to the Chaitya, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The Chaitya.
Huh.
These were basically rock-cut caves that provided that essential shelter for those wandering monks. They were simple spaces, almost like, just a hollow carved out of the rock to provide some protection from the elements.
Kind of like nature's own shelters, repurposed for spiritual practice.
Exactly.
Right.
But over time, these chaityas evolved. They weren't just simple shelters anymore. They became more formal spaces for worship. They were enlarged and decorated.
Yeah.
And they became these centers where the Buddhist community could come together to meditate, pray, and, connect with their faith.
So almost like a seed that sprouts and grows into something much grander over time. And then you have the viharas, right? These were like the more permanent monastic dwellings.
Precisely. Think of the viharas as the monasteries. These were more established structures often built around a central courtyard. They provided living quarters for the monks, as well as spaces for study and communal gatherings. And they were often located near those chaityas, those cave temples. So you had this whole complex dedicated to spiritual practice.
It's really starting to paint a picture of these early Buddhist communities for me, and those incredible stone pillars, we have to mention those.
Oh, absolutely. The pillars inscribed with Ashoka's edicts are crucial for understanding this period. I mean, think about it. You have an emperor choosing to communicate his ideas, not just through decrees, but by carving them onto these massive stone pillars.
Yeah, it's like having Twitter, but carved in stone.
Exactly. And these edicts, they weren't just about, politics or law. They touched on all sorts of things: morality, the conduct of war, the responsibilities of kingship, even Ashoka's own personal journey toward Buddhism. He really used those pillars to broadcast his vision for a just and righteous society.
It's a powerful statement in a very literal sense. These huge pillars standing tall across the landscape, communicating these messages for centuries.
Okay, so we've talked about shelters, monasteries, and these instructional pillars. But what about the most iconic Buddhist structure, the stupa? That's what a lot of people picture when they think of Buddhist architecture, right?
Absolutely. The stupa is essential to understanding early Buddhist architecture. Think of it as a semicircular mound originally made of brick, built to house relics of the Buddha. It represents, the Buddha's enlightenment, his passing into nirvana, and it serves as a focal point for meditation and devotion.
And the most famous example of a stupa has to be the Great Stupa at Sanchi, right?
That's right. The Great Stupa at Sanchi is an incredible example. Its construction started during the reign of King Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. But it wasn't just built once and then left alone. It was actually enlarged and embellished over centuries with additional features and decorations.
So it kept evolving. Exactly. The original simple timber fence was replaced with a much more elaborate stone railing called a verika. And then, of course, you have the Taranas, those four magnificent gateways that were added later. They're incredibly ornate with these intricate carvings that depict scenes from the Buddha's life and teachings.
It must have been quite a sight to see that transformation from a simple mound to this incredibly detailed structure. And it wasn't all stone and brick from the beginning, was it? I mean, you think of these early structures and you kind of assume it was all about those materials.
You might be surprised to know that's not entirely true. Excavations at a site called Vidisha have actually uncovered evidence of earlier shrines made from wood and brick. And these shrines, they weren't just basic structures. They had timber domes and vaults, which suggests that those early builders were experimenting with different techniques and materials.
So it adds another layer to the story, doesn't it? It wasn't just a straight line from simple caves to stone stupas. There was a whole period of experimentation and innovation in between.
Absolutely. And those early wooden structures, they might not have survived the centuries like the stone monuments, but they definitely played a role in shaping the architectural landscape of early Buddhism.
Okay, so we've got these fascinating insights into the early Buddhist structures, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about rock-cut architecture, specifically the caves at Ajanta and Ellora. You mentioned them earlier. These were Buddhist sites, right?
Yes. Ajanta and Ellora are both incredible examples of rock-cut architecture in India. And they're not just about Buddhism either. They actually feature a mix of Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain caves, all carved out of the same rock formations.
Oh, wow. So it was like a melting pot of different faiths all expressed through this one incredible art form.
Precisely. And the thing about Ajanta and Ellora is that they showcase the evolution of rock-cut architecture. You see a real progression in terms of scale, complexity, and artistic skill over the centuries. The earliest caves at Ajanta, for example, date back to the 2nd century BCE. And they're fairly simple. But as you move forward in time, the caves become more elaborate with multiple levels, intricate carvings, and these beautiful murals that depict scenes from Buddhist mythology and everyday life.
It's like those artisans were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible with rock-cut architecture. And Ellora takes it even further, right?
Oh yeah. Ellora is on a whole other level. It's home to the Kailasa Temple, which is the largest single monolithic rock excavation in the world. I mean, imagine that an entire temple carved out of a single massive rock face. It's dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva, but it's still a testament to the incredible ingenuity and artistry of those rock-cut architects.
It sounds absolutely mind-blowing. And you mentioned that Jainism also played a big role in the rock-cut tradition.
Absolutely. Jain temples evolved from rock-cut caves as well.
Mm.
And what's interesting is that the Jain community often included wealthy merchants and bankers among its followers, and they would often become patrons of these temples, which meant that Jain rock-cut architecture could sometimes be even more extravagant than Buddhist examples.
So you had this kind of interesting dynamic where religious belief and economic power combined to create these really impressive architectural achievements.
Exactly. And there was also a preference for specific materials. While Buddhists often used brick in their early constructions, Jain communities, particularly in western and southern India, favored marble. And marble, it's a beautiful material, but is also much harder to work with than brick or sandstone. So it really speaks to the dedication and skill of those Jain artisans.
And that choice of material must have had a big impact on the overall aesthetic of Jain temples.
Oh, for sure. Marble gives these structures a very distinct look. It's this luminous white stone that can be polished to a high sheen. And it really creates a sense of purity and serenity, which aligns perfectly with the Jain principles of nonviolence and detachment from the material world.
It's like the very choice of material is reflecting the core values of the faith. And these Jain rock-cut complexes, they weren't just single caves, right?
No, not at all. They often developed into these extensive networks of caves that included prayer halls, monasteries for the monks, and even living quarters for lay followers. And the craftsmanship is just incredible. The gigantic hall with a magnificent facade carved at Karl in the Western Ghats is a prime example. It's this massive space supported by these huge pillars with intricate carvings all over. And you just have to wonder what it must have been like to be inside that space to experience the scale and the artistry firsthand.
Yeah, it sounds like a truly awe-inspiring sight. So we've talked about these rock-cut structures, the stupas, the monasteries, but what about the Mauryan period? How does that fit into this overall architectural picture?
The Mauryan period, especially under Ashoka, was a really important time for Indian architecture. Before the Mauryas, a lot of the structures were made from perishable materials like wood and brick, which meant that they haven't survived as well. But the Mauryas, they really embraced the use of stone in their construction.
So they were kind of setting the stage for the later architectural developments.
In a way, yes. Excavations at sites like Rajgir and Kaushambi have revealed evidence of fortified cities with stupas, monasteries, and temples. And these structures, they're built using stone, which shows a real shift in building practices. And what's really significant is that they found a palace at Kaushambi that was built using dressed stone.
Dressed stone.
Yeah, that means the stones were cut and shaped before being used in the construction. It's a more sophisticated technique and allowed them to create much more refined and durable structures.
So even though many of the earlier structures might have been lost to time, you can still see the Mauryan influence in the later architectural styles?
Absolutely. They laid the groundwork for the widespread use of stone and the development of more complex architectural forms.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the influence of Buddhism and Jainism, the role of powerful rulers like Ashoka, and the advancements in building techniques. But you mentioned external influences earlier, specifically the impact of the Greeks.
Right. The Greek invasions in the 3rd century BCE, they did have a significant impact on Indian art and architecture, particularly in the northwest region, which is modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this interaction between the Greek and Indian cultures led to the emergence of two distinct schools of art.
Two different schools.
Yeah, you have the Mathura school, which was centered in the city of Mathura. It was more traditional and remained rooted in Indian artistic conventions. But then you have the Gandhara school, which was centered in the Gandhara region. And this school, it incorporated elements of Greek art into its style.
It's almost like a fusion of East and West.
Exactly. You see it in the sculptures particularly. The Gandhara sculptures, they often depict the Buddha with these very Hellenistic features like wavy hair, flowing robes, and a more naturalistic anatomy. It's a fascinating blend of styles that reflects the cultural exchange happening at the time.
So these Greek invasions, they didn't just bring about political change, they also had a lasting impact on Indian art and culture.
Absolutely. The Gandhara style, it spread throughout northwest India and even influenced Buddhist art in other parts of Asia. It's a really clear example of how cultural interactions can shape artistic expression.
And what about the dynasties that came after the Mauryas? What did they contribute to this architectural story?
Well, you have several dynasties that played a significant role. The Sunga dynasty, for example, they were great patrons of Buddhist art and architecture. They reconstructed the railings around the Barhut stupa, and they also built Taranas for other stupas.
So they were kind of building upon the foundations laid by the Mauryas.
Exactly. And then you have the Sarafana dynasty, who ruled in central and southern India. They were prolific builders of stupas, and the Great Stupa at Amaravati is probably their most famous creation.
Amaravati, that's another one of those names that you often hear in connection with early Buddhist architecture.
Right. The Amaravati stupa, it's thought to have been even larger than the Great Stupa at Sanchi, and it was known for its incredibly intricate carvings. It was a major pilgrimage site and a center of Buddhist learning for centuries.
So each dynasty was adding its own unique layer to this evolving architectural landscape.
Exactly. And then you have the Kushana period, which started in the 1st century CE. This was a time of great change and innovation in Buddhist art.
What kind of change?
Well, up until this point, the Buddha had mostly been represented through symbols like footprints or an empty throne. But during the Kushana period, there was a shift towards depicting the Buddha in human form.
So it was like a major change in how people visualized the Buddha.
Exactly. And the Kushana rulers, they were great patrons of this new style of Buddhist art. They commissioned countless sculptures and paintings that depicted the Buddha in this new way. And this style, it quickly spread throughout India and beyond.
So it wasn't just about building new structures, it was also about how those structures were decorated and what they represented.
Absolutely. The Kushana period was a really pivotal moment in the development of Buddhist art and iconography, and it had a lasting impact on the way Buddhism was visualized and understood for centuries to come.
Okay, let's circle back to Jainism for a moment. We talked about the rock-cut caves, but you mentioned earlier that the Jain ascetics, they had a strong preference for natural settings. How did that preference shape their architectural choices?
Well, the Jain ascetics, they believed in a life of simplicity and detachment from the material world. And that meant they often sought refuge in forests, caves, and rock shelters away from the hustle and bustle of urban life.
So their architecture was kind of dictated by their lifestyle.
Exactly. And they weren't just seeking out natural shelters, they were also creating their own artificial caves. We find evidence of man-made Jain caves dating back to the 2nd century BCE. And these caves, they provided the ascetics with the solitude and tranquility they needed for their spiritual practice.
And you mentioned the Karl cave earlier. That was a Jain cave, right?
Yes, The Coral Cave is a prime example of early Jain rock-cut architecture. It dates back to the 1st century BCE, and it's this massive chicha hall with a grand facade and these beautiful horseshoe-shaped windows. And inside, it's supported by these huge pillars with incredibly detailed carvings. It's a testament to the skill and artistry of those early Jain architects.
It sounds like an amazing space. And were there any Jain temples before the rock-cut caves became the dominant form?
Well, it's interesting because Jain scriptures, they do mention temples that might have predated the 6th century BCE, but unfortunately none of those structures have survived. It's likely that they were made from perishable materials like wood, which wouldn't have stood the test of time.
So the archaeological record doesn't really give us a clear picture of those early Jain temples.
No, it doesn't. But what we do see is that later on Jain communities, they started building more elaborate temple complexes, often located in pilgrimage sites. Places like Palitana in Gujarat and Ranakpur and Dilwara in Rajasthan are great examples of these later Jain temples.
And these temple complexes, they were quite different from the early rock-cut caves, weren't they?
Yes, they were much more elaborate and ornate. They often featured multiple shrines, courtyards, and these incredibly intricate carvings and decorations. And what's fascinating is that they often incorporated Hindu iconography alongside depictions of Mahavira Jain and scenes from his life.
So you see this blending of different religious traditions in the architecture.
Exactly. And another key feature of these later Jain temples is the use of marble. Marble was a highly prized material and was often transported from long distances to be used in the construction of these temples.
So it really highlights the dedication and the resources that went into building these sacred spaces.
Absolutely. And that use of marble, it gives these temples a very distinctive look. They're incredibly luminous and serene, which reflects the Jain emphasis on purity and nonviolence.
It's like the architecture itself is embodying the core principles of the faith. And you mentioned some specific examples of early Buddhist and Jain art earlier. Could you tell us a bit more about those?
Sure. So there's the Darganjakshi statue, which is now the Patna Museum. It's a beautiful example of early Indian sculpture. It's thought to date back to the Mauryan period, and it depicts the Yakshi, which is a female nature spirit associated with fertility and abundance. And it's just this incredibly graceful and lifelike statue that really captures the artistic skill of the time.
And what about the depictions of the dream of Maya?
Right. The dream of Maya is a really important story in Buddhist mythology. It's the story of the Buddha's mother, Queen Maya, and her dream of a white elephant entering her womb, which was seen as a sign that she was going to give birth to a very special being. And these scenes from the dream of Maya, they were often depicted in early Buddhist art, particularly on the railings of stupas. They're a great example of how narrative was used in early Buddhist art to tell the stories of the Buddha's life.
And you also mentioned the Gandhara Buddha.
Yes, the Gandhara Buddha is a very significant sculpture because it's one of the earliest depictions of the Buddha in human form. And it's a great example of that fusion of Greek and Indian styles that we talked about earlier. The Buddha is shown with these very Hellenistic features, and it really marks a turning point in Buddhist iconography.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground here today, haven't we?
We really have. We've gone from simple rock-cut shelters to elaborate stupas and temple complexes. We've seen the influence of Buddhism and Jainism, the patronage of powerful rulers, and the impact of cultural exchange. It's been quite a journey.
Absolutely. And I think it's really amazing to see how these early architectural forms, they weren't just about function, they were also about expressing these core beliefs and values.
I completely agree. Architecture was a way for these early Buddhist and Jain communities to embody their faith, to create these sacred spaces that reflected their worldview.
And it's incredible to think that these structures, they've stood the test of time for centuries, and they're still inspiring awe and wonder in people today.
It's a testament to the vision and the artistry of those early builders.
So here's a final thought for you all to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. We've talked a lot about the emphasis on nonviolence, or ahimsa, in both Buddhism and Jainism. But how do you think that principle might have subtly influenced the choices of materials and the overall aesthetic of their early architectural endeavors? Maybe in ways that go beyond the explicitly stated purposes of those structures. It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of early Buddhist and Jain architecture in India.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.